Joseph Schumpeter believed that the value theory of the scholastics was missing only the theory of marginal utility, a theory that is generally understood to have found expression in the last third of the 19th century in the work of three independent thinkers, Leon Walras, Stanley Jevons, and Karl Menger. Other scholars are not convinced that the scholastics indeed missed the theory of marginal utility. Blaug, despite the brevity of his treatment of scholastic economics, concedes that the doctors did develop utility cum scarcity doctrine theory of value. He notes that Aquinas' commentary on the fifth book of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics led to the view that the scholastics held a labour theory of value, ignoring Aquinas' insistence that all goods are valued only in relation to human wants. Scholastic economics based value squarely on the satisfaction of wants and, in its later version, related utility to the relative scarcity of a good. R. H. Tawney, however, claimed that not only did the scholastics not discover or propound the utility theory of value, but that, as he put it in a notorious passage, the true descendant of the doctrine of Aquinas is the labour theory of value. The last of the schoolmen is Karl Marx. However, de Roover ringingly rejects Tawney's claim, saying, the scholastics did not base their value theory on labour. If Karl Marx had any forerunners, they were David Ricardo and John Locke, not Saint Bernardino, Pierre Olivi, or Thomas Aquinas. De Roover comments, economists may be dismayed at the uncomfortable thought that two toothless, emaciated, and ascetic saints should perhaps be considered as the originators of utility theory. Incredible as it may sound, such seems to be the case. Saint Bernardino and Saint Antonino developed a value theory based on scarcity and utility, both objective and subjective. While Thomas's writings are not free from ambiguity, a reasonably unforced reading will show that, all things considered, he did not endorse, as Blaug clearly notes, the labour theory of value. In fact, de Roover refers to two key passages, clear and unambiguous, in the works of Thomas, to substantiate his claim that the schoolmen maintained a utility theory. Thomas writes, the price of things saleable does not depend on their degree of nature, since at times a horse fetches a higher price than a slave, but it depends on their usefulness to man. This shows that value depends upon utility or the ability to satisfy human wants. Another passage from Aquinas expresses more or less the same thought, though the wording is somewhat different. Thomas writes, in economics, things are not valued according to their natural dignity. Otherwise, a mouse, which is a living creature, would be prized more highly than a pearl, which is an inanimate object. But in fact, the price is set with reference to human wants. Not only was the concept of value as utility discovered by the schoolmen, but Saint Bernardino, following Thomas Aquinas, went on to distinguish between what we might term objective and subjective utility. While Saint Bernardino had a clear conception of value as utility, an idea which he apparently appropriated from Pierre de Jean, and while it would be true that he realized that utility as a determinant of price could not be absolute, otherwise, as in the hackneyed example, water would always cost more than diamonds, it is probably fair to say that he did not clearly elaborate a theory of diminishing marginal utility. Objective utility, virtuositas, is the character a good has of being able to satisfy human wants. Meat or potatoes, for instance, have an objective utility when it comes to satisfying the human need for nutrition. Small pebbles and CD players do not. Subjective utility, complacabilitas, is the appeal that a good has for a particular individual in particular circumstances. The two kinds of utility can coordinate, so, for example, all clothing is more or less objectively useful for protecting me from the elements, keeping me warm, serving the interest of decency, and so on. However, I choose the clothing I do because, given its objective utility, it answers to my particular subjective needs, desires, and interests. Not only may the two kinds of utility coordinate, given the human capacity for error, it is quite possible for the two utilities to disconnect. What, then, is the relation between utility and price? The scholastics in general were agreed that the just price of an article was set by the common estimation of the participants in the market. De Ruyver notes, later scholastics made a distinction between the natural price, by which they meant the market price, and the legal price. But this doctrine is not yet found in St. Bernardino, who still emphasizes that the just price is determined by common estimation. On the matter of the just price, Blaug remarks, there is no suggestion in the scholastic literature of a just price that corresponds to the cost of production as determined by the producer's social status. The schoolmen seldom gave much attention to what constituted a just price, but usually they identified it with the current market price, the price given to an individual which he cannot himself affect. Some thinkers who defended the setting of a just price by legislative authority were Jean de Gerson and Henry of Langenstein, both significantly nominalists, and Duns Scotus, who held that a just price was a function of cost of production. It's not that the other scholastics denied that prices could be set by authority, but they denied that this was either necessary or normal for justice to be observed. Langenstein is often cited in support of the thesis that the scholastics defended a labour theory of value, but in fact he, as much as other thinkers, considered the notion of want in the determination of price and distinguished the relevant roles of supply and demand. De Ruyver seems to think that the failure of such public interventions in the price system was a function of the absence of a well-organized rationing system, rather than an intrinsic feature of all de Regis attempts at central control. He and the scholastics are mistaken in this belief. De Ruyver notes that the nominalists, including Martin Luther, were in favour of price regulation rather than a free market. Among those willing to allow the cost of production a place in pricing, we find Pedro de Valencia, who proposed a maximum price on wheat predicated on the input of labour, and Domingo de Soto, although in the end he too admits that want is the basis of price. Diego de Covarrubias, on the other hand, held a subjectivist theory of value, believing that the value of an article was not primarily related to its essential nature, but depended rather on the estimation in which it was held by particular individuals. He noted that although wheat is a wheat wherever it may be, the price of that commodity differed in Spain and in the Indies because of the different estimation in which it was held in those places. Some, such as Sarabia de la Calle, do not wish to allow cost of production any role in the determination of price for a surprising reason. If cost of production were allowed to determine price, then merchants would always have a pretext for raising their prices. Sarabia writes, the just price arises from the abundance or scarcity of goods, merchants and money, and not from costs, labour and risk. If we had to consider labour and risk in order to assess the just price, no merchant would ever suffer loss. In order to determine the just price, we need only consider these three things: abundance or scarcity of goods, merchants and money, of things that people want to barter or exchange for money. This doctrine is founded on Aristotle's dictum: the price of things is measured by human need. Thomas Aquinas' teacher, St. Albert the Great, in common with most of the schoolmen, held that just price is determined by the estimation of the market participants at the point of sale. However, according to Grice Hutchinson, he also appears to have maintained something approaching a labour theory of value, inasmuch as the arts would be doomed to destruction if the producer did not receive a price that covered his outgoings, and derived from Aristotle the principle that commutative justice requires that in exchange the items exchanged must be absolutely equal. In regard to his alleged maintenance of a labour theory of value, I cannot see that the cited passage commits St. Albert to any such thing. At most it makes the common sense point that, generally speaking, a producer cannot continue in business unless income exceeds expenditure. No argument there. But the basic argument for utility still obtains, which is that if X is the price below which you are not willing to sell, and X is determined by your cost of production, no sale will take place unless A, a buyer is willing to offer X plus delta, or B, you change your mind and are willing to accept X minus delta, that is, to sell at a loss. Thomas Aquinas offers no explicit definition of a just price, but the cases he considers suggest that he believed that price was related to supply. Scotus was unhappy with the reluctance of the Thomists to delineate a specific account of intrinsic worth and just price. He realized, however, that the cost of production theory included an element for expenses, and that this element was open to exaggeration, with the result that the just price could be hiked up. Reflecting on this led him to consider the necessity for competition to, as it were, keep the merchants honest, and led him to condemn monopoly as fundamentally immoral. It should be noted as well that Roman law gave no consideration to the notion of intrinsic worth. For them, a price was just if it had been freely agreed to by the contracting parties. Luis Salvia concurred, denying the cost of production account given by Scotus. He wrote, "Those who measure the just price by the labour, costs and risk incurred by the person who deals in the merchandise are greatly in error. The just price is found not by counting the cost, but by common estimation." Schumpeter notes that the late scholastics identified their just price not, as Aristotle and also Duns Scotus seem to have done, with a normal competitive price, but with any competitive price. Wherever such a price existed, it was just to pay and to accept it, whatever the consequences might be for the trading parties. If merchants paying and accepting market prices made gains, this was all right, and if they suffered losses, this was bad luck or else a penalty for incompetence, so long as gain or loss resulted from the unhampered working of the market mechanism, though not if it resulted, for example, from price fixing by public authority or monopolistic concerns. The man in the street holds, pre-reflectively, that an exchange is just if the objects exchanged are equal. However, a moment's reflection reveals some problems with this position. What does equality mean here? How is it to be measured? Does it make any difference if we are dealing with an exchange of cash for goods or services or with barter? Take barter. If absolute equality were to be taken literally, exchange would be completely pointless. You would receive exactly what you had given. In making such exchanges, the actors would be like the islanders of legend who made a living by taking in one another's washing. No rational person would exchange in these circumstances. If different goods are exchanged one for the other, then the equality of each, since it is not manifest, must be measurable in some way or another. One simple way to do this is to take it that if both parties to the exchange are satisfied to make it, this, prima facie, satisfies the demand for equality. It might be argued that we can measure the value of the respective exchange items objectively against, let's say, the labour involved in its production and or associated expenses involved in bringing it to market. As mentioned above, while such factors are obviously going to enter into the deliberations of a vendor in deciding to make the exchange or not, they are not obviously objectively decidable. In any event, once again, such considerations can be taken to have been met if the buyer and seller freely agree to the exchange. If money is involved, then, once again, absolute equality, strictly speaking, is out of the question. If the exchange is made and both parties satisfied, what's missing? The equality that is to be discerned is the equal satisfaction of the exchangers, subjectively determined and manifested by their willingness to exchange. It is now generally accepted that an exchange will not take place unless each of the parties to the exchange is persuaded that he will gain, subjectively considered, from the exchange. It may well be that one or both of the parties is mistaken in this belief. In fact, this can well happen. But an exchange will not take place, assuming no coercion, unless both parties believe they will gain from the transaction. The subjective element, then, in price and utility would appear to be ineradicable. given the paucity of Thomas's scattered remarks on economic matters. De Ruyter remarks, there is very little on economics in the vast works of Thomas Aquinas, except some casual remarks buried here and there among extraneous material, and 2 or 3 more extensive fragments in his Summa Theologica and his commentaries in the Nicomachean Ethics of Aristotle. So given the paucity of these remarks, it would be unwise to put any great emphasis on them. However, what Thomas Aquinas holds, in contradistinction to the views of his teacher, is that an exchange should be mutually beneficial, so that each party is better off after it than he was before. Aquinas writes, "But this one standard which truly measures all things is demand. This includes all commutable things, inasmuch as everything has a reference to human need." The trouble with including a reference to human needs is that it seriously compromises the notion of intrinsic value, since need is person-relative. Buridan attempted to salvage the notion of intrinsic worth by relating it to the notion of usefulness, but this would appear to be every bit as compromising a notion as need, for it too is person-relative. It would appear then that value in exchange is subjectively determined, and that this is so whether the exchange is based on barter or on money. We can accept Grice Hutchinson's conclusion that St. Thomas's theory of value shows little significant advance on that of St. Albert, provided we accept that St. Albert did not endorse, except in the most trivial of senses, a labour theory of value. Thomas Aquinas, like his teacher, shows a lingering disposition to espouse a minimalist labour, that is, cost of production, theory of value, but the principal emphasis of our authors is that value is subjectively determined. Grice Hutchinson writes, "Some authors deny that the cost of production should be allowed any part in the determination of price. Others allow that it may be taken into account. But it is generally agreed that the most important factor to be considered in assessing the natural or uncontrolled price of a commodity are the estimation in which that commodity is commonly held, such estimation reflecting the utility of the thing in question, and the forces of supply and demand." Schumpeter sums up the issues under discussion by remarking that in the last scholastics there emerged a genuine subjective or utility theory of exchange value or price in a manner for which there was no analogue in either Aristotle or St. Thomas, though there was in both what we might describe as a pointer. First, the late scholastics, particularly Medina, make it quite clear that cost, though a factor in the determination of exchange value or price, was not its logical source or cause. Second, Molina and Lugo were as careful as Karl Menger to point out that utility was not a property of the goods themselves or identical with any of their inherent qualities, but was the reflex of the uses the individuals proposed to make of these goods and of the importance they attached to these uses. Third, though they did not explicitly resolve the paradox of value, they obviated the difficulty by making their utility concept relative to abundance or scarcity. Their utility was not utility of goods in the abstract, but utility of the quantities of goods available or producible in the individual's particular situations. Most significantly, Schumpeter concludes that the elements for a full-fledged theory of supply and demand were all present in the deliberations of the scholastics, and the technical apparatus of schedules and of marginal concepts that developed during the 19th century is really all that had to be added to them. The scholastic tradition from early to late contains analytically insightful reflections on many central economic topics. These insights anticipated later rediscoveries. We can discern a general trend in the approach of the scholastics, with local variations, from a more rigorous to a less rigorous position, from a position in which the intrinsic value of economic laws is recognized, if at all, only fitfully and partially, to a position in which they occupy a more central focus. We can see an example of the move from the more to the less rigorous in the matter of wage determination. Aquinas held that wages were, as it were, the price of labour, while St. Antonina requires no quasi, no as if, holding that the wage of the worker is a price that is to be determined, like any other, by common estimation, that is, by the market. Despite their insights, the scholastics were constrained in their development of economics by considerations of deference to authority and by the relatively slow development of the external economic conditions upon which to reflect. Taking everything into account, however, it is more true than false to say that the scholastics made a significant contribution to economic theory.